All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the co-moderators for First Fridays Winnipeg's Art Talks. And welcome to First Fridays in the Exchange. This is the first art talk of the 2021-2022 season. And there's all kinds of art events, open galleries, videos, and art to see tonight. So make sure you check out the What's On calendar at firstfridayswinnipeg.org. And I have to say, I'm super excited to see that things are open for viewing and seeing and buying and experiencing. It's great to see people in the exchange to get again tonight and to see it busy and alive. So things are still open after this talk. If you want to go out and check it out, definitely check the times and check the policies. Make sure you have your mask, your vaccination proof as required. And some venues will have capacity limits or possible appointments that you might need to make. So check out all those details again at firstfridayswinnipeg.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Süss and I'm going to read a land statement for us. First Fridays was started to encourage people to come to the Exchange District in Winnipeg. And we acknowledge that Winnipeg is located within Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Nahiawak, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We'd like to work together towards greater understanding and acting on how to decolonize art, artistic practice, and public discourse. And we've written a statement on spirit and art in the light of the current pandemic deaths and revelations of proof of past known deaths. So at this time, November 2021, we acknowledge that there are deep connections between spirit and art and trauma. When we are planning this talk and thinking about spirit as art, the country was both in the grips of measures to deal with the Delta wave of the COVID-19 pandemic and also preparing for the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. There are many public conversations about spirits who had passed and justice, and there are many heavy feelings. And we want to acknowledge that we're not going to feature art on these topics today, but we want to acknowledge the responsibility as an arts organization to tell the truth about our collective histories, to bring respect, curiosity, and humility to discussions with all artists, and to amplify voices in this direction. We, as moderators, pledge to do this throughout the First Fridays Art Talk season. And I'd just like to take another minute to officially introduce my co-moderator, Sarah Hodges-Kolisnyk. Sarah is a mother, an artist, a curator, and an art educator who approaches art through the lens of storytelling. She believes that art stories are nuanced, multi-layered, and keep us wondering. Sarah recently completed her Master's of Cultural Studies at the University of Winnipeg, where her research interests centered on the history and theories of photography, as well as museum studies. Sarah treats each art engagement as an opportunity to explore and is looking forward to inviting First Friday audiences on a journey to discover the myriad ways we can connect to the idea of art.
And I'll take a turn to introduce my co-moderator, J.A. Süss. J.A. Süss is a music therapist, creative arts educator, music director, and composer. They have made radio for CBC Radio 1 and CKUW, finding stories covering cultural events, personal documentaries, and music programming while holding down the studio as the on-air technician. J.A. Süss has released 2 singer-songwriter albums under the name Süss, where the songs tell the truth and weave fictions that are funny, sad, and harmonically interesting. They have been the host and band leader at many cabarets, and they are pleased to bring curiosity and openness to conversations for First Fridays Art Talks here on Treaty 1 territory.
Thanks. Now we'd like to introduce all of the people that are here with us as our guests, our guest artists. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start with our first guest and just say a bit about you. Jorge Requena Ramos of the Mariachi Ghost. Jorge is a multidisciplinary artist who grew up in Mexico City and now calls Winnipeg, Manitoba his home. He's done extensive work as a film director, playwright, and television producer. He became the artistic director of the WEC, the West End Cultural Center after spending a decade amongst performers traveling across Canada, the US, and Europe with his band, the Mariachi Ghost. This experience helped him develop extensive relationships with musicians and the music industry at large. And in his tenure at the WEC, he has overseen the growth and development of Winterruption, a festival that celebrates life in a winter city, even at 40 below. He's also helped the WEC transition into an anti-oppressive strategic plan that will see their programming and practices reflect the truly diverse fabric of Canada. Welcome, Jorge.
And I'd like to introduce Dr. Srina Khashoggi. Dr. Keshavjee teaches art and architectural history at the University of Winnipeg, where she also coordinates the curatorial practices stream of the Cultural Studies Master's Program. Most of her publications focus on the intersection of art and science and visual culture. Keshavjee co-edited Picturing Evolution and Extinction, Regeneration and Degeneration in Modern Visual Culture, as well as edited a special issue of Canadian Art Review on science, symbolism, and Fendesek visual culture in 2009. Keshavjee's current research project, funded by a 2009 SSHRC grant, is an anthology and exhibition on the scientific photographs of ectoplasm taken by Dr. T.G. Hamilton and his wife Lillian Hamilton during the 1920s and 30s in Winnipeg. The exhibition, The Undead Archive, is planned for August 2023 and will include contemporary artistic responses to these historical photographs. And we'll learn more about that later tonight. Thank you for being here. We also have artist Paul Robles joining us. Paul is Filipino-born and a Canadian artist based in Winnipeg. His practice is recognized for intricate cut paperworks, combining the delicacy associated with fine and traditional handiwork with themes of grief, folklore, animist mythologies, and spirituality. He creates a symbolic and identity-charged worlds uniquely his own. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Manitoba School of Art and a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from the University of Winnipeg. Robles has exhibited widely in Canada, US, and France, and has participated in Plug-in Institute's Summer Institute Residence Program, Papier Art Fair Montreal, and Art Paris. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Well, we're going to move into the next portion of our talk today, which is called Round One. And we're going to start with Jorge, and we're going to run a short round of slides for Jorge, and maybe we could see them as I'm kind of talking. So we've sort of done like something and the supernatural. So we've given you the title of Performing Archetype and the Supernatural. So I've selected a few slides from your video, Cuerpo Mortal, that shows some living piñatas, having some drinks, and doing some deeds. There's a slide of your first album, I think, and here we've got the piñata people starting. So I found myself captivated by the way that the paper floats in the air when they move, but thinking about the characters and the narrators of the songs of Mariachi Ghosts, I'm wondering, Jorge, if you can tell us about the characters in your first album. I think they're really relevant on this is like the second weekend of Halloween in like music and performing culture, but it's also, you know, the Day of the Dead. Can you talk about these things?
Yeah, this came about. The inspiration of this came about. We were creating a piece based on the work of the great writers of the magical realism movement. The entire album was kind of created in that aesthetic. The magical realism movement is incredible because it uses both the tradition of creativity in Latin America. All of the beautiful folklore is coded into the writing, but it's done by people who live in the modern era and in a modern way, with a Freudian eye, with an understanding of psychology and psychiatry, and kind of, in a way, making fun of the undercomings of looking at things from a spiritual point of view and a magical point of view, which is what we do in Latin America, and sort of kind of rooting the problems of everybody in magic. And so and it's just a really interesting, highly textured, culturally relevant way to look at things. And so we wanted to recreate that in our music. And there's a passage in Pedro Páramo, which is the leading work of magical realism. Some people are going to say 100 Years of Solitude. Sorry, it's not. Where one of the characters hangs another character on the rafters and lets them there to dry, and forever. Like, it basically leaves the corpse there, and that just felt to me like too much of a temptation to make it into a piñata. Like, why is it just like, is it full of candy? And so we created these characters that look like piñatas, and it's a metaphor for how we look at each other as like kind of superfluous, superficial beings with just a facade of, like, all of our contents are kind of just, ignored by the majority of the people, and it just reductive completely with each other. And in this story, people are mostly made of rumors other people made about them. It's about whispers of who you are, and you're not allowed to have secrets. It's a small town where everybody knows your secrets. And so, for Rafa, his character was named Santos, to beat the other character, Don Rafael, and take all of his secrets away and enjoy them as candy, and rejoice on the violence of his guts in a sweet, kind of childish way. Felt it's supernatural in a way, and it felt like the most magical way we could kind of achieve that. And it's a part of my work where, like, my visual work, where I always try to put the idea of violence as a sweet thing. Like, love is violence, and you know it if you've ever loved, that love is pain, and love is what it takes away from you. And so all these things that are important. So we wanted to find a physical representation of that. Life is made up of the things that are taken away. And so the piñatas are made up of the things that are taken away. You take away what's the guts of the piñata every time you beat one. And it's a party and it's a celebration, but nobody asked the piñata for permission.
I'll say that for anyone watching, if you want to go to themariachighost.com, you can see some of the videos there, or you want to go to the Mariachi Ghost YouTube channel, you can see some of the music videos there and hear them. During our previous conversation, Jorge, you had mentioned that the first character of your first album was kind of, he didn't know if he was dead or alive. And that kind of is like, talks to sort of the Day of the Dead, where, the veil is said to be thin between, the living and the dead. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, the character of Gonzalo, which is the leading character, the protagonist of our first album, is a character that doesn't know if he's dead or alive. And when he thinks he is the mariachi ghost, he feels the most alive, which is kind of like the irony of the metaphor there. And it's a justice-seeking charro that is kind of trying to punish the unfair, trying to punish the unjust, mostly the wealthy people of the town who practice injustice on the rest of the people of the town. He's constantly seeking to hunt for the Masons that are in the era where the Mariachi Ghost takes place. It's the turn of the century, when the train is just coming and modernity is just coming to this part of Mexico that still wants to be defined as a traditional part of Mexico. And so the idea of this new world that is being built it's a transgression to the ideas of the Mariachi Ghost. And so he's always kind of looking for who's profiting from everybody else's demise. He's enabled to practice this violence because he thinks he's a justice-seeking ghost. And then in the times where he realizes that he's a person, that's like when the suffering of his consciousness comes back. That duality is kind of what powers the entirety of the comic book / album that we created. All of the characters have some sort of duality that lives between the other world and this world in some sort of way.
I'm just going to take a second to remind anyone watching on YouTube that you can put your questions in the comments on the YouTube page, and we're going to get them in our chat, and we'll have a chance to address them here. So if anyone has a question for Jorge, or for anyone, you can just type that into the chat, and we'll address that. So the characters that you're talking about, Jorge, are seem very flawed and but very passionate. And one thing I know about having been to one of your band's shows is that it's like super high energy, but it also isn't. It does not like sound happy. It sounds like it's very sort of driving and and edgy, and has that sort of that really, it has minor keys, which like we consider in the West to be like sad, but they're not sad. It's super driving. Can you talk about sort of the role of grief in music and in dealing with emotion and the importance of hearing sadness in music?
Yeah, we only really write the very sad music, the saddest we can, with characters that are carrying constant sorrows and grief, characters that have lost everything or are about to lose everything or have taken everything away from other characters. And the reason we do that is because our brains need to exercise full, complete feelings. In order for us to achieve sort of a level of happiness, we need to actually feel complete sadness. We need to feel complete rage. We need to feel complete anger when it's necessary for us as a response to our context. But we don't often allow ourselves to do that. We don't allow ourselves to feel angry, to feel sad, and to grieve is a very complicated process where, we want to get over the pain, but the pain is what we need to live in order to be able to grieve. And so it's been proven by science that people that listen to sad music are on average happier people because they're able to exercise these negative feelings through art, and they don't have to necessarily exercise the negative feelings consciously in their lives. So being provided with this tool to sort of live in the moment of the art, the artistic expression that you're enjoying, allows you to actually be happy in your life. And so, to me, and I've always been this way, happy music just doesn't sound good. It's something that I find depressing and anxiety driving, et cetera, et cetera. And I prefer to get my happiness in real life, but I prefer to get my like anger and sadness and even grieving through music. And so I create music in that way, and we create music in that way in the Mariachi Ghost. During the creation of our last album, three members of the band and our producer all lost our fathers while we were creating the album. And the album took 7 years to create. So it's a long process, but this actually informed the creativity process for how we went about it. My dad died from suicide at the very end of the creative process. So like most of the vocal work had to be done after that. And it became a very complicated thing. And, it allowed us to kind of rethink how we were creating the music and who we are creating it for, and how we were going to use the music as a healing process for myself, but like for anybody who was there to listen to it and watch. And it was a cathartic thing. Like we created this music to create a play with it. We created a musical, and the musical happened. The staging of the musical happened in Halifax shortly after my dad's passing, and it was through the creating of the musical that, and the performance of the music as a stage play, where this man who was like trying to reconnect with a father that he never met, by going to the town where his mom and dad grew up, and only finding ghosts of his mother's past. That he reconnects with the memories of his father and his mother. And ironically, I was able to reconnect with the memory of my father, because the play took place in the place where my father grew up, and I had written it about family stories that my mom and dad told me. And so it was a very cathartic exercise to be able to create that. And so, like, it's almost like I was only able to grieve through the creativity of being able to put together the play, and later put a documentary together about my father's passing, and like analyzing the process of grief, to try and help other people who have suffered from suicide, who've been around suicide. A loved one has committed suicide. It's a very complicated process of grief, but it's the same simple kind of principle. You need to feel the sadness that you need to feel, and you need to feel the anger that you need to feel, and you need to eventually get to a place where you can forgive yourself and other people, and like come to a greater understanding. And I think that by exposing yourself to this kind of art, it is easier to achieve that. There's a lot of really great sad music out there, and I recommend anybody listening to listen to it. One of the reasons I love Radiohead is because they really write sad songs.
It's true. And sometimes music, as a music therapist, we've definitely, learned in studies and through watching people go through things, that music can be the vehicle for our feelings, and can definitely take on some of those roles, so that we don't have to, put them on another person, or, express them in words. That it has this way of carrying that for us. I just want to say thanks for sharing those stories with us. And I also am just going to ask one more question, and that is just about different concepts, like Western concepts of grief. We talked a little bit about Western concepts of grief, or, different indigenous traditions of grieving, and how, how spirit plays into that.
Yeah, in Mexico, for example, in traditional indigenous from the Nahuatl, which is like where people consider the Aztecs, is there's an underworld where people can go to, after going through this process of cleansing for 4 years. You're able to you're allowed to enter the Mictlan, which is where your soul goes. And in that, Mictlan is like a higher state of consciousness where you can go after you pass. And you're allowed to come back once a year to be with your loved ones after those 4 years pass. And that presence isn't understood to be like a ghost normal, like we think of in the Western world, of like a see-through Casper the ghost or whatever. It's a presence. It's your memories, your essence, or whatever. And so what people do is they leave an offering. They leave dinner out. They leave your favorite drink, your favorite candy, and set up in the table as if we're going to have dinner with you. And they have a dinner together with your memory. That this has become a fuller tradition after contact and after mixed with Catholicism, and it became a way to continue to carry out this tradition, which was like, it's an immoral tradition, which is kind of ironic, because the Spaniards tried to destroy this tradition so hard, but you can't destroy death. Death is still there, right? And so, it just carried forward for 500 years. It's like one of our practices that was never been able to be taken away. And so, it's not necessarily sad either, right? Like we understand in the West that death is immediately just sad and pain, and like it's because we don't get to exercise these feelings properly. We continue to grieve, but in pre-Hispanic traditions, it's a joyous moment to be able to spend time with the memory of your loved one. And it's still like that for us in Mexico. It's like you miss them, but you get to spend time with their memory and kind of raise their spirit from the dead, if you will, into the table. And remember when my dad did this, or when my uncle did this, or when my mom did this. Is oh yeah, we were buying this candy, and I remember. And all of a sudden, you get them back, right, for a little bit. And that's an incredible exercise that, like I learned to appreciate more when I left Mexico. And I didn't have that, right? I remember my mom making a very modest and small altar for her mom and for aunts and uncles that had passed away. And now we do that at my house with my kid for my dad, who he never got to meet, right? But I never got to meet my mom's mom, but I feel like I got to know her because of Day of the Dead. And so it's something that is very valuable that we've been able to keep up with.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think I told you a little story about my aunt who, when her husband died, as part of her grieving process, she just continued to talk to him and talk about, because he, in her memory, in her patterns, he was there all the time, and she just kept on, talking to him, and she just really, that was part of her sort of social tradition as well, as to do a lot of talking. And so she just continued to do that as she was grieving, and it was she did it in this really cheery way. So I really appreciate that, the way that those memories of our loved ones can come back as we honor different things about them. Just little things, like you said, a favorite candy, or in different ways like that. Thanks so much. I think go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say thank you both for sharing. I think that what you were saying really ties into, I think, what all of us are thinking about. And specifically, I know, Srina, some of your work touches on themes around grief and, crossing between different realms and connecting with spirits. So maybe you can fill us in a little bit on what you're working on and what you know about the Hamiltons.
Sure. Thank you. So I was just listening to the description of the Day of the Dead, and there isn't really an identical tradition in the West. And that's what I study. I study people interested in ghosts in the Western tradition, especially in the 19th and early 20th century. But in fact, it does sound very familiar. So a lot of people come to the notion of ghosts in the West through trauma, through the loss of someone. And I specifically look at what we call the modern spiritualist revival. So this is after World War I, between World War I and World War II, but also after the pandemic of 1918 and 1919. A lot of people turned to seances and spiritualism. We describe the spiritualist religion. This was actually a kind of, you could be a card-carrying member of this very democratic religion, where you got together once a week and sat down in a seance and conjured up a discarnate spirit. And this was usually a loved one. And many people in the room practicing seances had suffered trauma or loss, and had lost a child, actually. And I was last year or 2 years ago, before COVID, I was in Leeds at a conference about scientific seances, but there were lots of mediums in the room, and many of them had started that journey because they'd lost a child. So I think these are sort of similar ideas, but they've been kind of segmented out a little bit. And the Western tradition is quite a quiet one. Not everybody brags about their belief in ghosts, but since I've started this research, I see many people do have stories to tell me about different kinds of movement into the beyond.
Great. So can you show us some of your, there we go. We've got some slides. So do you want to talk about the archives that you've been studying?
I will. So I'm showing you two images here. The one with the man in the center is actually by Harry Houdini, the famous magician. And this is him poking fun at spirit photographs. So do you see he's got all the heads kind of pasted around? And the other one I'm showing you is actually from the Hamilton Family Archive, which is right here in Winnipeg, up the road at the University of Manitoba. So I'm specializing really right now in looking at the period in the 20th century, between after the pandemic and after World War I until about 1945, World War II. And then essentially this kind of falls off the map. And I'm looking at how scientists were interested in studying mediums and mediumship and testing to see whether ghosts are real or not. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is the Hamilton family fonds that I'm working at, and you see a spirit photograph with the two of them. There's a little bit of a blurry figure in the background. And then this is the cover of Dr. Hamilton's book. He died in 1935, but you can tell, I think, from this title, Intention and Survival, that even though he always claimed he was just looking for the truth, by the time he died, he 100% believed in ghosts. And he and his family conjured up ghosts for about 15 years. There are 700 photographs in that archive of these so-called scientific seances. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is some of the kinds of photographs you find in that archive. This is one of their most important mediums, Mary Marshall, and covering her is ectoplasm that she's excreted out of her mouth. And I just put that together with this book by Arthur Conan Doyle. So there's a couple of very important rare books in the Hamilton Family Fonds collection. And Arthur Conan Doyle is especially important because he came to Winnipeg in July 1923, and he gave a lecture, and I believe there were 1,500 people in this lecture. He gave an illustrated slide lecture on his interest in ghosts and spiritualism. And if some of you don't remember, Arthur Conan Doyle is the author of the Sherlock Holmes series. So it's a wonderful contrast between the super rational Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself, who believed in ghosts and spirits and actually came to it after the death of his son in World War I as well. So Hamilton, I think, was very impressed by Conan Doyle. He immediately sets up a laboratory in his house. It's some of you may know the Hamilton House. It's on Henderson Highway. The bedroom, one of the child's bedrooms, was turned into a laboratory. And that's where for 15 years they tested the mediums to see whether they were telling the truth, whether they really had powers or not. And they came to believe that they did. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so my specialty is ectoplasm. I don't know if you guys know what ectoplasm is, maybe from Ghostbusters. It's essentially a plasm. It's the fluid or the liquid inside cells. And it is excreted through the medium, through any orifice, mouth, nose, ears, eyes, any place it can come out. And then it is used by the discarnate spirit to create a form. So if you can see this picture on, I guess it's on your left. I hope I might be inversed with my dyslexia here. But we've got Mary Marshall, and there's a big white blob on her chest. And in the middle of that is actually Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's face. So after he died in 1932, the first thing he did was to come back to the seance room and say hello to Dr. Hamilton and the group there. The one beside that is called the umbrella ectoplasm. And then the third one that you saw a little bit earlier is actually this quite materialistic hand that appears. And hands are very important in all these ectoplasmic photographs. So this is essentially ectoplasm. In the 19th century, we have a much more ephemeral ghost. In the 20th century, because of technologies, but because of biology, you have a much weightier, more materialistic ghost. And it's really based on the breakthroughs of biology and cell biology. You know, the cell was only discovered by the end of the 19th century, where they really understood what the cell was made up of and how the cell worked. And they could see them with electronic microscopes. So what you have here is a recreation of biology around the cell. And this is the only way they could figure out how a ghost was conjured, was to be excreted out of the medium and then to take shape in the room. And so the last one, it's just a hand. That's all the medium had power for, was a hand, but sometimes you do get a full body. And maybe we can go ahead. Actually, I want to go ahead 2 slides if I can. Yeah, let's stop there. This is a good one. So I'm studying photographs, and I think my book might be called, 100 years of photographing ghosts, but actually I have 150 years of ghost images. So this is one from 1885. It's by a really important French superstar artist. His name was Jacques Tiso. And he also, because of grief, he had lost his partner and he went to a seance, and two ghosts were conjured that day, a kind of a spirit medium named Ernest, and then the love of his life, Katie. And you can see they're holding these lights, and the essence or the power of the ghost comes from those lights. So I'm really looking at how images change from the 19th century to the 20th century, but also how they change from painting to photography, because they were still using, scientific illustrations were still using drawing and painting in the 19th century. But by the time photography ramps up and becomes more affordable, it starts to disseminate, they have more Instamatic cameras and brownies, scientists, like everyone else, moved to photography. So I do like to compare 19th century artists' renderings of ghosts with what was happening in the 20th century. And if we can go to the next slide, Jorge was talking a lot about actually what I think really echoes surrealism. He was talking about magic realism, which the surrealists were really excited about. And he was talking about kind of the contradictions in life between sad and happy, alive and dead, imaginary, conscious and unconscious. And it actually reminded me that the surrealists themselves were also very, very interested in trance states. They went through a period of about 6 months where they actually created seances. And you can see a picture here of Breton and his wife, Simone, where they're all sitting around. Actually, they went through seances. They put themselves into trances. It turned out very bad. They couldn't wake each other up. And there was actually a group suicide. Breton once walked in and they were about to hang themselves. So they stopped doing it. But they really did believe that the trance state was the way to get into the creative unconscious. And they worked very hard to create that sense of otherness in their own brain, but it was all based on mediumship. They studied mediumship very hard. So what this really shows me is that mediumship's modern mediumship starts in the 19th century, about 1850, but it's still flourishing in some place like France in 1922. And certainly it was flourishing in Winnipeg in the Hamilton household in the 1920s as well. So this is kind of a pan-European phenomena of trying to find out about ghosts. So if we can go to the next slide. So I showed you two kind of nice artistic images, but Dr. Hamilton was a trained doctor. He was a scientist. So he thought he was examining things from a scientific point of view, and thus he used photography. And I'm showing you here some of the influences on him. On my right, you have this sort of vital force. It's an older 1850 drawing of the vital force. And do you see how it kind of radiates out of his eyes and the fingertips and even the poles of the magnets? This is all the vital force. And in many ways, this is the science that Dr. Hamilton accepted, that this excretion of plasma was done through the vital force. He often talks about the psychic or the vital force. So he knew those older illustrations, but he also modeled his work very, very strongly on a series of scientific illustrations of ghosts, actually from 1909 till 1914, done by a female psychic scientist, very unusual, and then a very famous sexologist, Dr. Schrenk Notzing. And I'm showing you their images here. And you can see that these images I often describe as being completely modernist in their style. They're black and white. There's a sharp contrast. You've got this beautiful luminescent sort of white cloth. You've got the medium. She's cropped. She's, there's odd angles. It's close up. It's enlarged. Her face is always very dramatic. So these are really very good examples of modernist photography. And at exactly the same time, modernist art photography was developing. And why I love these is because, for example, a very famous modernist photographer, Moholy-Nagy, actually included 12 of these images in his most important 1929 show called Film and Photo, where he decided to change the style of photography for the rest of the 20th century. And he had all kinds of images in there, including these scientific images of ghosts. So all of this is to tell you that this was hard science, really. I mean, I'm not saying everybody was doing this kind of science, but there were about 40 doctors and physicists around the world that Hamilton was very close to who were looking at a scientific illustration of ghosts and trying to replicate it in the room. So we can go to the next one. Just showing you kind of the range of scientific photos. You can see Hamilton's one again with the hand. It is really influenced by the ones from 1909 to 1914 in that it's very clean lines. He even created an ectoplasmic costume. He set up a very minimalist background. And then I'm showing you some other ones. The one in the middle is actually the kind that Conan Doyle showed, and you might recognize these as being more of a 19th century model. Do you see all the veils and those beautiful kind of doll-like faces in the back and the family sitting there? So much fussier and much more pictorialist than what we see in the Hamilton image. And then the other two on the side, the one on the top is actually from 1871, and it's probably the first spirit photograph by a scientist that we have. And I would ask you to think about the weightiness, the fleshiness of this ghost. Some people, of course, think it might have been the medium herself dressing up. This is William Crooks, probably the most important physicist, I don't know, in 200 years. Like if you look him up on Wikipedia, all you'll see are his amazing discoveries around physics and also the wireless. Sometimes the wireless technology is attributed to him. And yet he took 44 pictures of the ghost, Katie King, the ghost. And actually, I think he might have fallen in love with her because he even gave her a present. So, you know, in the 19th and 20th century, believing in ghosts was much more normalized. It was not quite as maybe marginal as it is today. By 1945, that is over in the scientific world, but there's a big window before that where you could be a scientist and study ghosts and be accepted in the community.
Yeah, I think today we're so jaded by, you know, thinking about things like Photoshop and how images can be manipulated, and we don't realize that photography was built on this indexical quality, right? That the way a camera functions, light has to bounce off an object in front of the camera lens into the camera. So this moment of reality actually happens. And there's a certain kind of alchemy in the way that photography's developed that people, you know, didn't understand and didn't have that same kind of jadedness about at the turn of the century. And oh yeah, thank you. I was going to say, if we go to the next slide, this image always really strikes me when I think of this as an illustration about why people could, you know, I think we want to debunk these images, these spirit photographs as soon as we see them. But that's not kind of their value and whether they're true or not. And this is a great example. This is Fernando Sanford doing scientific experiments again at the turn of the century. And it's a photograph of an electrified penny. And you can see the aura of the electricity around the penny. And so the scientific community is making all these amazing discoveries, and photography has a key role in this, photographing electricity, X-rays, studying facial patterns and all kinds of things. And all that comes into play. And if we can now communicate across realms using radio and electricity and things like that, why can't we also communicate with spirit realms as well? So thank you, Srina. Yes, all those things are really interesting and exciting. And I think, you know, and I'm a photographer, so I'm really drawn to this idea of the alchemy. And Roland Barthes has talked about that the act of photographing itself is kind of making you a specter, because you're creating this kind of uncanny doppelganger that exists in the world, and you're freezing this moment for eternity in the photograph, kind of like a corpse. And in fact, some of the earliest photographs were of corpses because they could hold still long enough, right, for a photograph. So anyways, I want to maybe move to think about some of Paul's work, because in very different ways, you know, you're thinking about some uncanny ideas and the spirit in the art realm, not in the science realm. So maybe we can look at some of your work, Paul, and you can tell us a little bit about where your inspiration comes from. Oh,
Oh,
there we go.
there's one.
Do you
Yeah.
want to talk about that one?
Oh, that's actually a work in progress. That will be partly part of a larger installation for Serina's exhibition in 2023. I started working prior to me talking to Serena about her show. I had started making these, what I called clumps on the wall, of just like mishmash of paper cuts that sort of looked like ectoplasm. I don't know if I was really thinking of ectoplasm, but when I put them on the wall, they basically looked like, just like a stain or a sort of something coming off the walls. They look like vines, or they look like some sort of, with like the flora and fauna on it and stuff. So
yeah, actually, if we go forward a few slides, sorry, Paul.
Oh, it's okay.
I think we have some of those as well. There we go.
Yeah, so those are definitely what I think Serena had seen, and they're bigger now. So those were done over the summer, actually during the pandemic. And so they are definitely bigger now. And so they're just kind of all over the wall. And they're just made out of sort of my lexicon of cutout familiars and characters. I don't know if there's a close-up, but there's snakes and tigers and sort of birds sort of throwing up in those clumps that I'm making. And so, yeah, so they definitely, I guess, translated to Serena's thesis, definitely, when we actually did a Zoom studio call too, because it was during the pandemic. So, yeah.
Yeah, if you can go forward a slide, I think we can see a close-up there.
So again, these are really new works, and there's more details of the red clump. I don't know if I'm going to stick with that title, but they're basically that's what I call them when I go into the studio, and I've also started using iridescent film, window film that is a part of some of the clumps, and there's a monkey shape there that's sort of one of my characters, my trickster in my world. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, Paul, could you speak to that a little bit further? I know you have a number of animals that you work with in your work, and maybe you can talk about where that inspiration comes from and what they mean to you. And Aaron, if you go forward a number of slides, there should be some animal shapes as well.
Yeah. So I'm a paper cutter, and I actually started out as a photographer. I did my thesis in mixed media and installation and photography. And I went to school at the time where photography was analog. So I had negatives, and I would work in the darkroom, and we would blow up prints on the color machine at the School of Art. And the biggest print I could make was like a 16 by 20. So back then, this would be in the late 90s. It was sort of magical to do color prints that way. But yeah, so I started off as a photographer, and then I had started using actually some props, doing portraitures of people with origami flowers in their mouths, which I wish I had a picture of, but those would be in my early works. And so they had these flowers coming out of their mouths that I had folded. And at that time, like photography was quite expensive to print. So if I didn't get a grant, I would work on other mediums. And origami paper was always around in my studio. So being sort of like a little punker, I started cutting them, because in traditional origami way, you're supposed to fold. They're never supposed to be cut. Paper's never supposed to cut on origami. So I started cutting them, and that's what sort of started the whole paper cut road for my practice. And it was basically, so this would be like early 2000s. I'm really horrible with dates, but what really shifted my work and sort of gave it sort of a next level was the death of my dad, which would be 2011, and it was sort of towards the end of the year. And that sort of just taken what I had cut and sort of made series of paper cuts using the animals. And the animals are sort of based off of Asian and primarily Chinese zodiac, and we all sort of have a familiar associated to it. So it's the year of. So I mean, I'm a rooster, and I'm sure you guys know what you guys are. So it's very similar to Zodiac mythology. And so in 2011, my dad passed away suddenly, and he actually, and I'm thinking of this now, like he actually died in Mexico at the end of the year on a full moon. And so it all kind of came crashing down, but I also sort of that was my process of sort of dealing with this sudden missing, my dad missing from my life. So, I mean, I said goodbye to him when he went on his cruise, but I didn't really say goodbye to him. So basically, I started making these works, sort of dealing with all that, and I started making these sort of, I call them moons, but they're very circular. They're like kind of like mandalas too. But I started making these dark moons of my lexicon of animals. So that's how it started. So 2011 was basically sort of like the crossroad of my practice to becoming, dealing with what the mediums that I've been working on and sort of elevating it into a world that I sort of created to deal with things like that, grief and trauma.
Yeah, I think we actually have some of those works. Aaron, if you don't mind, if you could bring up some of those, the dark moon images. They are just before Serina's next slides. Yeah.
So these are the moons, the circular pieces I call them black moons. I also found out that I found my work towards those years and the years after my dad passed were really colorless. Like they were dark. I just used black paper, and I also used paper that was half burnt and singed and sort of had stains on them. And so that whole sort of a couple of years after his death, they were basically a monochrome series of dark moons. So sort of honoring, I guess, like entering into another world, but also sort of creating a world here that's very familiar and sort of relatable, I guess. And then like it was just only recently, and I guess I had another tragic, well, I guess it would be tragic, is like I was part of a studio fire just before the pandemic, I guess 2019, so fairly recent, where I lost all of my work. So as a practicing artist, having this body of work in your studio and it's sort of just cleaned out for you, like suddenly it was sort of like, okay, like is my past is now erased, but is it really? And so I lost basically a lot of my work. And so in 2019, at 2020, I basically got a new studio and sort of rethought of what should I be doing? What do I continue? Do I remake my work? So I was sort of I wouldn't say struggling, but I was sort of contemplating on a lot of issues like that. And then that's when color came back in, and I started using color paper. And ironically, it was during the pandemic year that we all sort of shut down and stayed home. So it was quite interesting how I dealt with the pandemic. So
Yeah, actually, if we could put up, we have an image of the See Hear Speak with the monkeys in Old Market Square that everyone enjoyed so much.
Yeah, a month ago, New Blanche. So that project was amazing. That was through the Winnipeg Arts Council. Thank you, Winnipeg Arts Council. And so I was sort of I was asked to do this piece that was for Nuit Blanche, and I knew it was for a week, and it was supposed to be pre-pandemic. It was supposed to be put up before the thing, and then, delayed. And I started thinking, like, what is the state of our social gathering now? And like, are we allowed to? We have to be 6 feet apart. We can't really touch each other. We're all masked up. And so I wanted to create a piece, primarily like secretly, sort of like, well, I got to see my nephews and nieces all in my family through Zoom and sort of across the fence and sort of like that. But I wanted to create a piece or installation that sort of brought them back together naively. But basically, so I basically made these inflatable monkeys, which is a brand new material for me. And I did actually incorporate, and I don't know if a lot of people notice, a sort of a ghost face in these structures where a lot of people did selfies in the mouth part, but I don't know if I ever noticed that there was sort of a face in these pileups of monkeys. So like, you can see the eyes and the mouth there, but yeah. So I guess I've always been interested in the other realms, and I think that comes from sort of like, I'm going to call myself Pan-Asianness, because I was born in the Philippines, but I grew up in Canada, and I sort of softened my ethnic edging by learning, by becoming Canadian, even though my family, had Filipino traditions and stayed within the Filipino culture in Winnipeg. But so I've always been sort of like, and I think it's a popular trope for sort of artists like in my situation, where you take two concentric circles and you go like this, and I'm really interested in that space between the circle. And so I think that's what my work is about. It's about that space that goes right, like that sort of, I wouldn't say purgatory, but just sort of like that space that sits there for us.
Mm-hmm. Those intersections between realms.
Yeah. And I think it really plays on Serina's thesis with, dealing with other realms or other spaces. And I come from like a Filipino background, and Jorge and Serena had touched on the Day of the Dead, and the Philippines were colonized by Spaniards. So we have very similar traditions, but mixed in with really strong Catholic rituals. So so you take the religious and sort of the folklore of Spain, and you mash up with the Philippines. So that's also comes into play in my work. So
yeah, I think we had talked about that your grandmother had kind of myths and stories that she would share with you and influenced you as a child.
I think everybody's grandmother sort of had those I guess, I don't want to say old wives' tales, but this tales of like, don't go outside when it's raining or has lightning or thunder. There's like, every culture has a witch symbol or a zombie or undead sort of character in their mythology, and in the Philippines, an aswang, which is sort of a female creature. My mom would probably, that's my lack of, but basically this female creature would sort of sit on the roofs of your houses during a rainstorm and lightning and thunder. And we were always told as kids that, you don't go outside or don't go near the window because the aswang will come and get you. And so there's those things that you tell kids, and I think that happens in all culture. But and then you tinge it with sort of Christ and the devil. You just sort of you, as a little kid, that's what you get grown up. You get taught about. So about the world of the spirit world. So yeah. And so these new pieces. So these pieces are sort of. So these are really brand new. I sort of made these series of humors, like the 4 humors. And so they're sort of reflected on the seasons, but they're also about, so the 4 humors are sanguine, melancholic. I'm going to forget this. There's you can Google it, but there's 4 humors that are based on winter, summer, spring, and fall sort of thing. So these sort of mass-like images were also done during the pandemic when I was in my studio quietly working away. And so that's what sort of, these are what are based off. So yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I wonder, I should point out that Jorge had to step out and get ready for the Mariachi Ghost show this evening. But I know Süss has some things to share with us, and they probably tie into some of the things you just shared with us, Paul, as well. So thanks for talking about your work a little bit. We'll come back to all those ideas in a few moments. But Süss, if you wanted to walk us through a few things about Jorge's work, that would be fabulous.
Sure, I'd love to do that. I think we all noticed that Jorge was wearing some makeup for his show, and we had sort of discussed some of the evolution of the makeup, but I'll just say that that the makeup is called, it's the tradition of a sugar skull, and it is sort of a tradition of the Day of the Dead. It's a candy that's shaped like a skull, and it's that sort of makeup of the sugar skull has become very it's a thing that people wear it as makeup. Some of the dolls in and images in the Mexican Day of the Dead imagery have the sugar skull on it, and you could see their band there is warming up for a show, and you could see that even this slide has like the blue on the side, whereas the first ones had the black on the side. So that's one evolution. You could see Ian Makita, their drummer, pretty clearly that just half of their faces are filled with the sugar skull, and you could see the teeth there's an evolution in the way the teeth are there. And then further, we are moving into what they're more modern, or what they're doing now in their shows, which is having the cheekbone skull, and then the blue eye is a bit of evolution. So that's an interesting thing. I won't speak. And there's another member of their band. I just thought I'd capture. His tongue looked so funny there, so I thought I'd just seize that image, just for fun. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the makeup that Jorge had, and we wish them to have broken legs, to break legs for their show. Sorry we couldn't speak right to the end, but this is the way it goes on show day sometimes. So we're grateful, Jorge, that you joined us, and thanks for showing us the makeup that you had that we would have talked about had we had a chance to. So yeah.
No, thanks I appreciate the transition in the makeup is really interesting, because Paul was talking about his work and how it's transitioned. And so we see these different applications. And I think it does actually as well tie into some of Srina's work, and maybe not so much transitions, but how artists continue to respond to these themes and these topics around grief and spirits and death and mourning. So I don't know if you could, there we go. Yeah, Srina's slides are up. So Srina, did you want to speak to some of the artistic response that you found to the archives?
I will. So one of the things that I noticed, I've been interested in this archive for maybe 20 years, and I noticed that artists were always hovering around and working with it, and there were no art historians on site. So I thought it was weird. Art historians were not figuring this out or not interested in it, but artists were. So I decided to kind of dig a little and see what artists were interested in the archive. And I think I now have a list of at least 10. And you got to see Paul's work earlier. There are actually a lot of artists who have come from across Canada, from the UK, from Ireland, who've gotten grants and who've actually worked in the archive, looking at the Hamilton images. Sometimes people are just going online because they're beautifully represented online. But there are a number of artists who are really doing, I would say, recreations, their own versions or interventions with the Hamilton archive. And before I go on to that, I want to say that when I got the money from SSHRC, one of the things I asked for was a little bit of experimentation where we could actually recreate the photographs themselves, so I could learn how they were made. And this was so wonderful because Sarah was coming into the program, and she happens to be a photographer who knows all about analog photography. And of course, she could find a camera from 1930, which is what you're seeing here. So this sort of really fell into place for us. So Sarah was my RA last year, and we worked in the archive together, and you can see us there. But even better, she did get this camera. She found large plate film, like over large size. And then we used a model, which was another student. This is all students all the time for me. And we actually recreated them. And Sarah was asking a little bit earlier about fraud, or, what was going on. There was no fraud on the glass plates. Sarah's looked at them. Bill Eakins looked at them. I've had a lot of photographers look at them. There was no fraud in the darkroom. Dr. Hamilton was not doing any double exposures or weird things in the darkroom. So that means whatever happening was happening in the room, which was dark, right? You had to have a completely dark room. They had a little bit of a red light sometimes. And then they had the medium and the witnesses in the room. So Sarah set up all the conditions. We had it dark. We had weird lights. We had a flash. We had our model. We actually made ectoplasm at home using different materials like gauze, plaster of Paris. I rated my children's model kits. I mean, we all came with something. And we recreated, this is just off my iPhone. Actually, Sarah has the proper prints that were developed that actually replicated in some ways what was happening. So I learned a lot through this process as to what was going on or what might have happened or how these images came together. And there will be a little didactic panel in the exhibition explaining this, showing the documentation and showing how Sarah put them together. So I don't know how you guys feel about the ones with Lily, but I think they're suitably creepy to kind of work.
And I should add, actually, if that's okay, you talked about fraud and things like that. Cameras were widely available by the 20s when the Hamiltons were working, of course, right? We have Kodak box cameras and things like that. So the general public knew how to take photographs, and things like double exposures and some of those tricks were happening by accident when they're trying to wind their cameras. So of course, the spirit photographs had to get more sophisticated and happen off the actual negative. Yeah, sorry, you can continue.
No, that's okay. It's true. And it was really important for me to try and figure out how it could have been done. And also, I must tell you, Dr. Hamilton seems to be the most upright citizen in the world. Like I've read now thousands of pages of archival notes, and I know that he wasn't cheating. Like, this is not a man who was cheating. So I don't necessarily believe in ghosts. There are ghosts in the room. So somebody's doing something. I don't quite know who it is. And I'm not even sure I want to find out, because this is what Sarah was making the point about, that electrified penny. It's not really that important to know who the fraudsters or the tricksters were. It's more interesting to me to understand that these kinds of photographs were taken seriously by a bunch of doctors, lawyers, witnesses in the room. I mean, you can imagine Dr. Hamilton was quite a wealthy settler in, 1920s in Winnipeg, very well-respected doctor. And he was friends with all the doctors and lawyers in town. And they all sat in his seance room, and they all signed affidavits that they had seen an ectoplasmic excretion. So it's the most serious guys in Winnipeg all saying this. So somebody's pulling somebody's leg, and I'm not sure who. It might be those, he always described them as uneducated but lovely ladies that were the mediums. And, maybe that's what was going on. Maybe the heroic scientific doctors were being duped by the nannies in the room. So, there's some things to investigate here. But let's go on. If we can go quite a bit further to, I've got some funny ectoplasmic photos down there.
Serena, I have a question for you. Serena, what's the status of the house now? Like, what? Is it empty? Does someone own the Hamilton house?
Okay, so there's some news. That Hamilton house was for sale, I don't know, for a few years. Like, I went through it. I brought Bill Eakin through it. Like, we were, interested in buying it. Chris DeRose went through it. And it was quite expensive. And, we thought, maybe we could raise money and make it a medical museum, because he was a doctor. His surgery is down there. It's all intact. It's a bit broken up, but all the important things are there. But no one can afford it. Nobody wants another small museum in Winnipeg. There was no way we could fundraise for it. But it was just bought a few weeks ago. And I only know this because the archive sent me I think it was a CTV story. So it was bought by a local person, and they are going to have a store, but they're interested in the Hamilton history. I think the archives are going to reach out to them, and there may be some preservation of things. So it might be a place we can all go and visit. And I think it could be a tourist destination, especially with the right photos there. If you recreate that room, it could be a kind of a spiritualist museum. And since I've traveled now all around the West giving lectures like this, there are people that would travel to Winnipeg to see Dr. Hamilton's house. So I think it could be something really great. So I had mentioned that there's at least 10 artists who have worked directly with the Hamilton images. And here's one of them. This is Teresa Burrows. And I met her through Instagram, of all things. Like, I post every now and then, and she just came back with these images for me. So the beads, it's actually kind of string and beaded ectoplasmic excretions. And you can see her head peeking out. And I actually want to put the beads in the show, as well as the photograph of her with the beads as ectoplasm. And then apparently she came to a lecture I did at the WAG. Again, this is pre-pandemic. So it might have been 2019 or even January 2020. And I did a whole spiel. And then she went home and she got some gauze and she recreated the Hamilton images. That's a recreation of the umbrella one. Do you remember that cone-shaped one? She has them in different colors. She has them black and white. She's outside of Winnipeg, so we have never met. We only correspond through Instagram, and she sends me these delights. That's why there's so many, the picture's a little bit weird. But I've already said to her, I want you in the show, because she's doing something locally. There's quite a few artists locally who are playing around with the images. Now, this Grace Williams is actually in the UK. She has a PhD. She teaches photography, and I actually don't think she's ever been in Winnipeg, but she saw the pictures online, and she does these kind of interventions. So this is based on one of the images of Mary Marshall's hand, where there's a little excretion coming out of it. The other one, you can see she's done these sort of interventions of big circles right in the middle of the images. These are the teloplasmic images where the table goes up in the air, and I think the circle is covering the table. So she's got quite a few of these, and actually a beautiful movie, a stop motion movie done in the style of like 1912. So I'm fingers crossed that I get the funding that she can be included in the show. If you keep going, this is actually a friend of Paul's, Erica DeFreitas. Paul made the introduction for me. Erica came here, I think 2009, 2010. And to me, this is one of the first set of artistic renderings dealing very closely with the Hamilton, but doing something quite contemporary. So she had her mom and her grandma crochet doilies. And then she used them as the ectoplasm. Is this not the best thing you've ever seen? I love these. So I talked to Erica by Zoom, and she actually thinks she has about 100 different photos. The set has never been shown. There's like 2 or 3 places where bits and pieces of them were shown. So I'm like, oh, I need to go to Toronto. I need to see all of these, and then decide how many to bring here. And they are prints. They're not, it's not a digital. This is a hard print. But this is wonderful. And she's done 2 or 3 other series, actually, that involve hands and different versions. Usadina Palladino, a very famous other medium. So that's something she and I are exploring kind of on Zoom. I'm very excited to get to see them in Toronto. I'm going to show you this necklace that I wore today. Do you see this?
Yes,
this is by Trish Wozni, who is a local artist and jeweler. And I commissioned this because she made something called the ectoplasmic ring, which I couldn't believe, so beautiful. So I said, can you do a necklace for me based on the form of ectoplasm? And Trish is even going to allow me to put little photographic faces, they're called face forms, in it, when I want to make it into real ectoplasm, and I wear it as a necklace. So how amazing is that? So Trish will have a case in the show. And if you keep going, I think I mentioned that I'd gone to Leeds, and I'd gone to a big academic symposium with mediums and with this photographer, Shannon Taggart. who is photographing contemporary ectoplasmic excretion. So there's maybe 3 people in the world that still do it, and she's found them and she's photographing them. And she has a show right now in Baltimore. This one here on my left is actually a movie. It's a stop motion movie that's amazing. So I've talked to her. She's in Minneapolis right now, and I'm hoping she's going to drive up, look at the Hamilton collection, and be a part of the show. And I think actually that's it. I had Paul's, which you've already seen. And then the only thing I was going to end with is that talking to Erica, talking to Shannon, talking to a few other people, they've all noticed an uptake in interest, and Krista Rose as well, an uptake in interest in the supernatural post-pandemic. There's a big show in going to Minneapolis called Supernatural Art in America. Even just doing a Google scan, there's a lot of exhibitions out there. So I wonder if the current trauma and grief coming out of the pandemic and isolation and mental, there's the slide, thank you. And, sort of mental stress that we all went through, whether, again, we can see a correlation between trauma, grief, and the supernatural. I don't know. I'm hoping some of the historians involved in my book, especially Essel Jones, will do that quantitative research for me and see if this is true. But anecdotally, the artists I'm working with said all of a sudden there's a much wider reception. There's a witch institute going on right now in Kingston. Chris's show, Rosa's show, Dark Matter, was on this summer. I don't know. I'll throw that out to the audience. Maybe someone can tell me what they think.
I'll just take this moment to remind everyone that if you do have a question, you can type it into the chat in the comments under the video on our YouTube live feed. And just say, I just want to comment, Srina, on the artist who had the multicolored doilies as ectoplasm. I thought it was a really interesting connection that she had gotten her family to make those, and sort of it ties into sort of the things that we've been talking about in terms of ancestors and the connections that we have to these images, and exploring these the topic of ancestor and the connection to spirit in Western culture. We just have time for a couple more comments or a few more questions as we're getting a bit closer to 8 o'clock. So there was one question in the chat, which was for Paul. And Paul, we're wondering if you could talk a little bit about the technical process that you're using for making your intricate paper cuttings.
Oh, I wish I had a elaborate story, but it's actually very simple. It's just an X-Acto knife and me drawing and cutting. So it's very much like a traditional hand work, lap work almost. I could sit at my desk and just cut. So I don't use any machines. I don't use any technology. People have asked me why not and make it faster, but I think the slowness and the process of my work is very important. And I think the evidence of my hand, because the cuts aren't like, there are nicks and there are rips, and if it's ripped really bad, I start again. But I like the evidence of my hand on there because it's handmade, and it does take a while. But I think the process of cutting is a big part of my practice. So a piece like the clumps on the walls, I mean, I started that over the summer, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So I don't know what Srina will get in 2023. It might be like The Thing, like that, that horror movie, The Thing. It'll just be this giant thing on the wall. So, and that's just a really small part of it. It's bigger. Like I said, it is bigger now. Yeah, it's basically me with an X-Acto knife, like someone who's drawing my utensils on I do use a pencil, but my stylus is a blade. So it's very simple. Yeah.
There's a comment that says, "Wow, you must be a very patient person."
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, it's like I don't know. It's probably as meditative as like knitting or a lot of lap work. I mean, I'm sure it's part craft, but it's also like drawing. So it's similar to
Well,
that.
in all sort of traditions, whether it is whether you're like looking at an idea over and over again, or whether you're doing an experiment or trying to figure out how to do it, or whether your active art is like in doing and doing again and doing again.
Mm-hmm.
This is familiar for me as a musician, but it's also very familiar for the lines between art and craft as well, which is like the repetition. So science, any scientist will tell you that it's you have to do. You can have an idea, but then you have to do something over and over again
Over and over
to
again.
produce
And a lot of my pieces, that's super true. Like I'm got to the point now where I can actually cut multiples. Like I will fold and cut, and I will make I'll make the piece like triple the piece at this point. And I will take sections of the same three pieces and sort of stitch them together like Frankenstein. But yeah, I mean it is a long process. I mean, some of my works are sitting on the wall for pretty much like a year until it comes back and tells me what to do. So, but I mean that happens to all artists. Like I mean, some people will have paintings on the go and sort of just let it sit there for a while. But so I'm very similar. Paper obviously is super delicate, so I have to be conscious of that. And with origami paper, I have to be super conscious of the color because my studio is very well lit. It's an old warehouse studio with large windows, so the colors could fade. So I have to really be conscious of that too. So yeah, definitely. There's definitely a tradition to what I do, for sure.
So I have a question that anyone can jump in and answer. I was just reflecting and thinking on Serina's last question and the fact that Jorge and Paul had both kind of mentioned effects of colonization and things like that. So I'm wondering that maybe through this, moving towards decolonization or decolonial art practices and BIPOC artists and things like that, does that open up room for exploring different interpretations of spirit, and maybe that also is contributing to some of the increase in these different themes and these different ways of approaching these themes in the artwork that we're seeing today?
Well, I'll start. So I've come to realize that every culture has some element of spirits, ancestors, ghosts. I only know about the Western one because that's my research, but every single culture has one. I know there was a big show in Paris in the Musée Quai Branly on Japanese conception of ghosts. I know that in, Jorge mentioned leaving out food, but there's other cultures where you leave out paper representations of radios or televisions and you give them to the ghosts. This is really around the world. So I was looking to see if there were any other authors out there that were doing something different. And there's some stuff, but it doesn't quite fit in. So I am speaking to some local Indigenous artists who are thinking about ancestors, and we're in conversation. So I'm hoping that will be another element, especially in the exhibition, and maybe then in the images in the book that will deal with at least local Indigenous conceptions of ancestors. So that's something we're actively looking into.
Yeah, and I think, it's just about being human. I think every culture sort of has a story to tell, and there's a lot of storytellers out there. And you can go back to cave paintings and the drawings in caves and sort of looking up at the sky, and then you have the religious aspect of it. I just think it's all about being human and sort of retelling our story on and on again. So yeah.
Yeah, and art being a particularly strong vehicle to express those things that sometimes we can't in conversation or words, of course. So yeah.
Yeah, and we use the things around us to create objects or to create, symbols of our feelings that will help us on the way. We've just got a few more minutes left. Just being the timekeeper today. There are a few comments in the chat. Compliments for Paul, basically.
What was Serena's research? She must be really patient.
It's a lot to think about. So, hey, commenters, how about Serena's research? I'm just teasing. So yes, Paul just saying, I'm just going to read the comments out loud that, people are really appreciating your hand process and that your art is exquisite. So thanks,
thanks.
for the commenters.
Yeah, thank you.
Do either of you want to talk a little bit more at all about meaning and about connection regarding the search for spirit or an uptake in spirituality after trauma? Does anyone want to talk about that a little bit more?
Actually, I have a question to all of you guys. Is like, do you guys believe in ghosts? Like, what scares you?
Oh my gosh, everything scares me. I'm a chicken.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of like the horror genre. If I go to a movie or something and I find it to be too suspenseful or scary, I'll just make a choice between looking or hearing. But I can't sometimes do both. So if I decide to close my eyes and just listen, I can just appreciate like the scariness of the music. Or if I plug my ears, then I can just analyze the plot or like the photography or something like that. But I just find the two of them paired in the frightening, in the ways that it's supposed to be frightening, I get too involved.
Well, we have a question for Srina. Have you ever had an encounter with a spirit or any paranormal adjacent experience yourself?
Well, this ties in so nicely with Paul's question. So almost never have I had an experience that might make me think I believe in ghosts. I think I'm open to it because this is what I study. So I know a lot about it, but I haven't experienced, except, do you remember I mentioned I was at this conference in Leeds in the UK, and there were a lot of mediums in the room? Well, they did a simulation, as they called it, of a seance. So they said, this is really a theater of a seance. It's not a real seance. And they made us all hold a piece of string with a washer on it. And we were supposed to hold it very steady. So I was literally holding it like this. And then they said, and now spirits enter the room, and everybody's washer was moving. I mean, I had no idea how this was happening. And mine was moving a little bit. The woman beside me, it was like going like this. And we all were like very, very still. And I realized that had I been alive 100 years ago and I had gone to a seance, 100% I would have believed. I would have been right there with them, enjoying it. And I don't know if you know that seances would have been a lot of fun. There was chanting, music, people are holding hands. There's like voices. There's a lot of gender bender play. So men became women, women became men. This was all okay. There was no Victorian moral code in the seance. So I think they were very entertaining, and occasionally they were very, very moving. And I had that little bit of a taste of it in that simulation. But beyond that, no, I have not had any kind of supernatural meetings or movement.
It's funny, when I grew up, and I'm not really dating myself, but when I grew up in the 80s, I had a board game, a Ouija board game. And we used to play like a regular board game. We would use the Ouija board with the, what's it called? The planchette. Planchette is the thing. And I was kind of found it fascinating that it was, marketed to kids to play like as a board game.
Yeah, and our families were okay with it. That we would play with them. Yeah.
Some of our families.
Yeah, mine was, yeah. Well, maybe if anyone out there who's listening has some fabulous ghost stories, they can post them on their favorite social media and tag First Fridays Winnipeg and share them with us after the talk, because that would be really fun. But if there's no more questions, I wonder if no one else has anything to add, if we should wrap up this evening. Going once. All right. Well, I think we have a few folks to thank. I would like to thank our supporters, the Free Press, the Manitoba Arts Council, the Winnipeg Arts Council, and Creative Manitoba for their support tonight.
And I have a few people to thank as well. I just want to thank our First Fridays board for helping us through this process of doing this multi-artist talk, with multi-moderator talk, and just helping us get our season off the ground. I also want to thank our guests, Srina and Paul and Jorge. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your work. It's been really excellent and eye-opening. I'd like to also thank Rachel Andershuk from First Fridays, who really helped us along in getting ready. And really want to thank Collective Broadcast for really moderating and organizing the screen and helping us put it onto YouTube so everyone could enjoy our live presentation. And the person from Collective Broadcast that has really been helping us has been Erin. So thank you so much, Erin, for your help. And I just want to, we've hit 8 o'clock, so I just want to thank you everyone again. And I wish you all a lovely night and an enjoyable First Fridays evening and enjoyable First Fridays to come.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everybody.